Hello, and welcome to episode 77 of our podcast at Human Restoration Project. My name is Chris McNutt, and I'm a high school digital media instructor from Ohio. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters, three of whom are Steve Peterson, Tim Fox, and Aaron Godot. Thank you for your ongoing support. You can learn more about the Human Restoration Project on our website, humanrestorationproject.org, or find us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Today, we are joined by Evan Whitehead, a veteran educator who is the Director of Special Services at a K-8 school in Illinois. Evan has served in a variety of roles, from crisis behavior interventionist, to Latino parent outreach coordinator, to Title I director. Further, Evan actively presents on reaching at-risk youth, leadership, and self-care for everyone in education, and is a national consultant for the AHA process. The reason why I've invited you on, Ev, talk about teacher self-care, and right now, probably more than ever, self-care is needed as we head into a very unique and potentially radically different school year for the better. Could you talk a little bit about what you talk about when it comes to self-care and what educators could do to prepare for teaching during a pandemic?
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Chris. I think in terms of self-care, right? The earlier that we start, the better, right? I'm a big proponent of prevention rather than intervention. It's kind of about what have we done prior to this moment to get ourselves anchored? And if we haven't done that, this is a great time to start now, but we should also be mindful and conscious of trying not to do too much too soon. So just some basic things about self-care, first and foremost, are we getting enough rest? Because of the way in which the end of last school year ended, and then also the summer, sleeping patterns have changed, right? For not only our students, but also for us as educators. And if for parents, probably our children's sleeping patterns have changed. So making sure we get enough sleep and get enough rest is important as well. And then also, make sure that we're eating properly. What are we putting into our body? When are we eating? Because all those things are important in terms of core principles for self-care. The other part is kind of taking out time to make sure you're organized. There's been a very quick shift for a lot of districts and schools in terms of going for crisis learning, as I put it previously, that we were in, to now, if we're going remote or hybrid or whatever the model may be, if we're all in person, is making sure that we're organized and we're ready for the school day. The other thing I would say is, making sure that we begin to really have time to do some reflection and be able to pause during our day. Give ourselves some grace to do that, because things are going to be going so fast, and I don't care if it's your first year or your 25th year in education. This is brand new for everyone. Giving ourselves permission and giving ourselves grace to feel as though, it's okay. We don't know everything right now, and we're going to take it day to day, week to week. And, it's okay if we don't have all the answers. Because I think a lot of what's going on right now, there's a lot of angst that's going on, just because we don't know. There's a lot of unknown, and sometimes the stories that we tell ourselves in our head are actually worse than the reality of what it could be and the mistakes that may happen. So I think just some of that is just being able to sit down, reflect, and pause, and just understand that we're all going through this new, and hopefully we'll begin and things will begin to settle. But just giving ourselves time to do that.
Right, and I think there's something to be said when it comes to reflection. I'm personally someone who tends to overplan. I am very bad about going home and just taking a break. I can't turn off sometimes. Something that I've realized very quickly going into this upcoming school year is that less is definitely going to be more. There's no reason to pick 20 different ed tech tools and try to integrate a different one every single day and think that students are going to be quote unquote engaged for 45 to 90 minutes every single day, when that's not what happens during a typical school day. A lot of that time is spent doing other things. Could you talk a little bit about how teachers could maybe arrange their class or arrange planning for their class in a way that can keep them motivated?
Sure. I think the point that you said is true, Chris, is that what we once knew, in terms of the school day, doesn't necessarily fit now. And it's almost like we're trying to cram everything into a remote or a virtual setting as we did in school, and that's not realistic, right? So in terms of your planning, make sure, like, first and foremost, if you're going remote or you're a hybrid model, you should be putting time into each subject area or class, virtual class, that there's a time for everyone to kind of come together and talk, check in with people, see how your students are doing. Let your students know how you're doing. Give the students time to interact with each other. That needs to be built in. Definitely building in the schedule time to check in with students. But prior to that, making sure that there's some time that teachers take before they even begin their instruction time for themselves. A nice transition to start the day. And then during that schedule, making sure that there are breaks in between subject areas to give the students a little bit of a brain break, but also for the teachers as well. Also making sure that there's a lunch built in, just as if we were on site. And then at the end, making sure there's time to transition and kind of decompress from the day of being online and in a remote teaching situation before we transition into our personal life at home as well. Because oftentimes, we kind of just speed through and forget that there needs a time for us to switch hats, so to speak. So that having those times built in are going to make tremendous gains for what we need to do for ourselves in terms of our self-care. And also, I think our students will appreciate it as well, because they also need to learn a new schedule and new routine. So as we build it in, it'll be definitely effective for the student and the teacher as well.
Something that I want to talk about with you to take a critical lens at self-care is this intersection of justice and kindness. So a lot of times when we talk about SEL, it gets framed as positivity, which it should. You should be positive about the environment that you're in and express positivity. At the exact same time, in that balancing act, I think some maybe are pushing for positivity too far to the point where it becomes toxic. And we're no longer recognizing that the world is not necessarily perfect, and we shouldn't just readily like walk back into the school and say like, oh, things are great and we should just treat it as great because I'm practicing self-care in air quotes. Do you want to talk a little bit about how toxic positivity can be counteracted while still practicing self-care?
Yeah, you know what? That idea of the toxic positivity, as you spoke to, is really because we're not self-aware, or we choose not to be self-aware, right? Life has its ups and downs, it ebbs and flows. And, too much of anything is not a good thing. And really, there's definitely like a continuum, right? Although social emotional well-being and social emotional learning does try to focus on things being positive, the reality is more it's about how do you navigate life's challenges, life's stressors, and just the everyday life so that you can strive, and that's it. So I think some of that can be dangerous because the reality is we've come back from what we're still in, a global pandemic hasn't changed, even though there's a lot of the language we use talks about, a second wave coming or spikes in terms of cases. However, it hasn't changed. It's still here. COVID's still here, and people are still suffering from it, and we're still seeing the manifestations of that. Also, in terms of social justice issues, it hasn't gone away, even though some of the hashtags and social media have kind of disappeared and not trending as much as they were before. Those challenges still exist, and I think part of that, is that's where the SEO comes into play, right? Where are we? How are we self-reflecting? Where is our self-awareness? Right, understanding what our strengths are, what our challenges are, what we do well, what we need to work on. Also, in terms of the social awareness, right? That idea of just because we're back to school and everything's going to be fine, pushing the positivity is great, but also understanding the social context in terms of where we are right now is important. And I think that's often missed as well in this. The self-care comes into play because yes, we want to prioritize ourselves, but there has to be a balance with that, right? There has to be a balance in terms of where we're putting our energy, where we're putting our efforts in, how we're doing, what it looks like. Because if we just imagine or want to imagine that simply by me thinking positive, things are going to go better. That's not the reality. There has to be action behind it. The idea of students wanting, just because they want to learn, we have educators have a responsibility to help facilitate that learning. This whole idea of social emotional learning is a journey for everyone, and it's a journey for the adults just as much, because we have to be able to model what we want for students, and students are going to come to us with challenges, right? They're going to come with the typical life challenges that they had previously, but now they're probably magnified. So we have to be in the right state to understand that, not to think that so bad that they're beyond help or beyond, the challenge they have are so strong, but really, how can we help them to understand where they are, what they need to be, and how to build, a life around that so they can be a lot more successful and be able to navigate that, because that's what it's about. It's about the resiliency. And if we think that everything's going to be easy and it's going to happen overnight, that's not realistic. So we have to be able to be realistic and authentic about our work as well in terms of self-care and self-management.
That's really interesting that you bring up the word resiliency, because that to me is something that we struggle to model with our students, because it's hard to be resilient when you're constantly demanding better, especially surrounding issues of equity where from an SEL perspective, it can seem like the world's burning, figuratively and literally. It's one of the toughest topics to bring up with coworkers, with administration, and feel like you're going to be met with, I don't know what the right word is, but not every work environment is going to be receptive to talking about issues of equity, at least openly, beyond the hashtags, beyond just putting a message on the website. How can then educators balance practicing self-care when they're talking about these issues that are systemic and wide-ranging and sometimes kind of disparaging? How can they just make that work for them?
The idea is that this self-care has to work for you, and what does that mean within your context, right? As an organization, right, we have to get better as that as a profession, and recognizing the importance of it and making it a priority. As leaders, I include myself in that category. We have to give space for those that we serve and those that are working in our schools and our districts to do that. We can't keep expecting so much from everyone else, and then say, oh, by the way, make sure you practice self-care. Well, when do I have time to do that, right? Are you adding so much onto my plate, and are the demands so high that even if I want to talk about self-care and put myself first, I really don't have time to do that? That's, I think, where we have to be able to understand that, and what does that look like? Equity today, it appears so different, right, than what it once did, and there's so many components to it. So I think as we begin to kind of deconstruct what equity looks like, think about what it looks like within our own local environments, right? What does that look like in our classrooms, in our schools? What does that look like in our communities? Because there's not a one size fits all. It's just acknowledging what that means and defining that and have a clear definition and a common understanding is important, because there's this misconception that as soon as we talk about equity, we're talking about race and talking about ethnicity, right? We forget about all the other areas, such as gender, such as socioeconomic status. We think about religion. We think about an inclusion of students with disabilities. All these areas, like English learners. And I think that we need to define that and really get a grasp on that, because sometimes the word equity is a trigger for some that creates a barrier. So we have to be mindful of that, so that we can have those conversations. We don't put too much on people. I think that, coming back this school year, there's been so much that's happened over the summer. What are we expecting of our educators? Are we expecting them to be equity experts now because of reading some books and having some book studies, which I'm all for awareness. And I think that's the first step. However, now, does that necessarily mean that they're ready to facilitate conversations with that? Do they have the ability to, are they in a safe place to have that, in a safe space to have those conversations? Because that's part of the self-care too, right? Do you want to put yourself in a situation where it's just too much for you? You can't handle it, because now are you taking too much on, right? Are you ready to do that? Are we asking kind of I don't want to say the usual, but the typical people to do that work, and are we expecting them to do it all the time, along with everything else that they have to do? That's to me, that's kind of where the self-care comes into, right? Are those champions those people that are typically champions of equity, that are the ones that are willing to do the additional work, are those the ones that you always lean on, especially now? Are you leaning on them so much that they don't feel that they can take care of themselves? That's kind of where I see where the self-care and equity, kind of come into play. That work is draining, right? To be an advocate, it's draining. To be a champion of that work is draining. And that's where I believe issues such as compassion fatigue start to set in, because often we want to do so much, and then we start feeling the pain of often those that we're trying to serve. And sometimes just because we're willing to do that, or we have in the past, we end up inheriting the role of having to do that within our organizations, and we forget about that. We have to make sure there's a balance to take care of ourselves as well. So I think that's something we need to be cognizant of, and as I speak to my leaders, make sure we're cognizant of that as well, and not putting too much on those usual people, so they don't start feeling burned out, and feeling that they're tired, and they can't take care of themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, burnout culture in the teaching profession is already commonplace. And now I'm sure that it will only grow unless we take some measures to lessen it. I mean, you see teachers left and right, my own workplace and online, who are highly concerned about the additional planning it takes to plan an online class, or to plan, especially a hybrid class where you're basically teaching like 2 or 3 classes at one time. It's like additional preps. What ideas would you have for educators, or maybe even administrators, to basically systemically integrate self-care for educators? We talk a lot about students, and giving them breaks and allowing them choice, and the many, many, many different elements of progressive education, human-centered education. But what does that look like for teachers during the workday?
As administrators and leaders, we have to build that in to the day now, right? What are we doing? How are we doing? How are we checking in with our staff members, right? And it can't just be, wait for that, monthly staff meeting, because now we're already separated and isolated physically. Waiting once a month is not enough. Things that we've done in my school district during the beginning of the pandemic is that we had, about 3 times a week, we would set aside time where we would provide social emotional well-being for our educators prior to them starting their instructional day. So for example, the day would start at 8:30. So like from 8:05 to 8:25, we'd have a social emotional well-being time where we come in and ask how they're doing. We talk about different topics and have some guest speakers come in, just so they can get anchored in themselves and have an opportunity to prioritize that. That's time that administrators can protect to make it happen. And it doesn't have to be, and don't make it mandatory. The reality is, what we saw in my district was that people wanted to come because there was some consistency for them to anchor themselves and to get that into their day. So even though we didn't make it mandatory, there was no additional pay for that, they wanted to come and they look forward to it. So I think as administrators, we need to think about that. Also, we need to think about is listen, right? We have to listen. We have to listen to those that we serve and what's going on, and be cognizant and aware that we have to think about people as human beings again. We all have lives. And I think the biggest challenge right now is that, the multiple roles that we have, as people, are coming to a head right now. And, you're asking an educator and a teacher to be a teacher during the day with their 20 plus students. But then if they're parents, they have their own children that could be, working, have a remote learning situation at home. If they're a husband or a wife, so now they have the role of the spouse. And then some are caregivers, elderly, parents and family members. So we have to understand that everyone's going through something right now. And just because we see them for those 6 hours, we can't forget that they have a life as well. So I think as administrators, we need to be cognizant of that and give people the grace and flexibility to work through this, and give them that time, and not try to put too much on them, right? Kind of the invisible work of educators is the fact that everyone sees us and says, oh, you have summers off, you have all the paid holidays, right? And you have all this time, you work Monday through Friday, but they don't know about when you're grading papers on, after work, when you're grading papers on the weekend, when you're going to classes during the summer. Like, all these other pieces are involved, and I think we need to remember that that is part of the person and part of their daily experience. So we need to not put too much on them as administrators, so they can have their weekends off, right? So they can have time to spend with their families. Not too much on them, so that after their day of working, they're not doing so much in this extra planning, so that they can't relax. That's part of it. They need to be able to do that, and we have control of that as leaders. What time we protect, how we protect it, and then also the time that we're able to give back.
Yeah, and I can't help but think as you describe each one of those things, flexibility, grace, scheduling, how that applies to students as well, just kind of going down the line, not expecting students have people that they take care of, they have families that are struggling. I'm particularly concerned about unemployment and the economic ramifications of what that's going to do for our community, and just like really basic things that were already there but are now exacerbated during the crisis, and what that means for educators. Something that's helped me as an educator since spring is setting firm boundaries. The ability to say, like, after 4:30, after 3:30, like, I'll get to you tomorrow, and not feeling bad about that, and setting up the class in a way where people don't feel pressure that they have to get something done constantly all the time, where that would be stressful not to be able to get in contact with a teacher. Because otherwise you're in a perpetual state of like, well, the computer's there and I could check it, and maybe someone sent me a message, and you're doing that once every half hour for ad nauseum. And it's draining. With that being said, Evan, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have anything else that you would want to add or plug or something like that?
I think that, the conversation we've kind of talked about it, but, that's my big push is my three B's of balance, boundaries, and breaks. And that's what I talk about a lot for educator self-care and well-being. And it's true, we talked about balance. What does balance look like, right? Why do we need balance? The importance of balance. And I think that now it's more important than ever that we begin to understand how critical time and energy is and how we use that, and we can't just give it away, and we need to invest into things that are going to be reciprocal, whether those are people, because people can be draining, also sometimes well-intended, but they can be draining, and also kind of the projects that we take on as well, right? Understanding kind of and prioritizing what we need to do and what we want to do. The other part is the boundaries that you talked about is critical. As educators, we don't have a good track record of setting personal boundaries. We respect everyone else's, but we don't often adhere to our own. We say yes a lot, and we don't say no. And it's important that we do that for our self-care and wellness, because if not, people aren't going to say, hey, Chris, why don't you slow down a little bit, or don't take this on, or hey, Evan, you know what? You don't have to stay till 5 o'clock tonight and your office. You can go ahead and leave at 3:30, right? Those are things that we need to think about. What does that look like in terms of our personal health and our physical health, right? It's okay for us to go ahead and say, you know what, I don't feel well today. I don't have to push through and come into work, just so it looks like I'm doing my job, right? There's a reason why we have sick days. We need to take them when we're truly sick, and especially now, right? Even though, we need to be so mindful of that, because I can tell you the culture of education and educators, we're not good about taking our sick time and taking our medical concerns when we need to. That's why often there's so many like illnesses that run through schools so quickly, right? And we need to be mindful of that. So that's especially now that we talk about boundaries, is truly important. The last one is breaks, right? Taking that break, taking that time to pause, taking that time to reflect, taking that opportunity to take advantage of that time that you can spend reflecting, time you can spend with your families, and just unplug, right? We're so focused on laptop, cell phone, whatever our device we have, we're always plugged in. It's okay to unplug for a couple of hours, right? I know everybody can't do it for a full day, but go ahead and do it. Try it for an hour. It'll make a huge difference, just so that you're not on a schedule, so that your body and your mind has a chance to just recuperate. So, just in parting, I always encourage people to think about my three B's of balance, boundaries, and breaks. How can it help you? How can you apply it to your own personal life? And just take care of yourselves, so you can be the best person, so you can take care of others that you serve.
I hope that this conversation leaves you inspired and ready to push the progressive envelope of education. You can learn more about progressive education, support our cause, and stay tuned to this podcast and other updates on our website at humanrestorationproject.org.